August 5th marked the 50th anniversary of the Beatles' album Revolver. It was the group's 7th studio album, and it saw them build upon the musical progression we heard on their previous LP, Rubber Soul. In the years since, Revolver's status among rock and roll fans and rock critics has risen considerably. Once it was common to see Sgt. Pepper top best ever album lists. Well, that situation has changed dramatically. And for the past 30 or so years, Revolver typically holds that number one spot. Beatles author and expert Robert Rodriguez joins us once again. He's helped to facilitate that change with his book, Revolver, How the Beatles Reimagined Rock and Roll. Robert, what in your opinion led to Revolver becoming widely accepted as the group's masterpiece?
It seems the tide began to turn possibly in the aftermath of the CD issues, when suddenly the UK iteration with the 3 additional Lennon tracks suddenly became available and became the currency in America to fans that only knew the 11-track version, which had more George songs on it than John songs, for the one and only time. So maybe that shifted it back into, the artistic statement that the Beatles intended, and that was maybe revelatory to some people, or it just could have been, years of having Pepper shoved down everybody's throat as the greatest, that people, another generation of savvy music fans began to re-examine things, and suddenly the consensus started to move away, whether it's out of being contrarian or actually really appreciating that, wait a minute, this deserves a second look. That sort of worked out that way.
And I think one of the elements that works in Revolver's favor, and it's something we don't quite get on Pepper, is the band dynamic. Revolver, despite having disparate styles of music on it, sounds like the product of a cohesive unit.
Absolutely. And it's the kind of thing where once you start really looking at it and thinking about it, you can do some research and then find out for yourself, oh, I see why this, Pepper has this particular flavor, because it was really being driven by Paul McCartney and George Martin, who were really working together very closely. Lennon was being dragged along and would contribute well when you could engage him, but, he was really deep into his acid phase at that time. And then you've got George, who's sort of withdrawing from the whole rock and roll thing at that point. Here's the Beatles' lead guitarist who's writing songs on keyboard that year and really sort of forsaking his guitar duties. Paul's taking them up throughout the album while George studies Eastern mysticism and sitar.
Yeah.
So it's something that was not true a year earlier when they're working on Revolver. And that's a big, huge change in dynamics that really underscores the point of why Revolver was so important, because there you have the Beatles firing on all 4 cylinders, all fully engaged, and all of them on the same page, and wanting to make the best possible Beatle music there could be.
In the past, we've spoken about how the American version of Rubber Soul stands up as a valid listening experience. But in the case of the American iteration of Revolver, shaving off 3 Lennon compositions does this record a great disservice.
Yeah, it really sort of hamstrung it for sure. When you're missing I'm Only Sleeping, Dr. Robert, and And Your Bird Can Sing. Certainly I think most fans would rank at least 2 of those as among John's finer compositions of the Beatles mid-period. And so you're missing that. And that on the whole leaves this very eclectic, sort of weird, semi-experimental collection of tunes. And, at least those 3 songs were the very more basic guitar-driven, traditional Beatles sound, as it were, even though, subject-wise it's very different. So you remove that from the mix, and what you're left with is something that I think a lot of fans found hard to wrap their heads around at the time. It was just a very strange collection of songs.
Well, let's start going through the tracks here, beginning with Cut 1, Taxman. And it was very unusual for George Harrison to be given the lead-off cut on a Beatles album.
Yeah, that was exceptional. But it really points to how they, number one, recognize it as the obvious lead-off track. And it's got, a count-off on there, so naturally that's part of the recording, and it's like, where else you got to put that? It's perfect. And it really, I don't know if this was a conscious thought in their heads or not, but it's sort of them easing into the next phase of their career with this album that is largely comprised of material that you could not reproduce on stage. And so in that way, it's like recalling their debut album, which starts, of course, with a count-off.
Right.
And so here we go into phase 2. And so it's an echo of that in a very weird sort of way. But then you've got, just as a recording goes, all 4 of them on a George Harrison song really stepping up their game. with John contributing some of the lyric content, Declare the Pennies on Your Eyes, Ringo stepping up as this drum performance, it's just outstanding throughout, and Paul's lead guitar, just sort of channeling George's Indian obsessions, but really pulling it off on a song, that obviously George was the initiator of. And so there's no finer example on that album of all four of them really rising to the occasion on one song.
It should be noted that, as far as I know, I never heard George complain that McCartney played the lead on Taxman.
On the contrary, he was always quite complimentary about it. And, the Jeff Emmerich book notwithstanding, which is so full of fanciful observations, particularly relating to George and his playing abilities, where in his depiction of it, they finally got so frustrated with his inability to come up with the goods that they just handed the guitar to Paul, who immediately nails it in one take. That has not a ring of truth about it to me at all. And I think, George, who certainly showed through the years having a bit of a troubled relationship with Paul, has been nothing but positive about his contributions to that song and appreciative of that little nod to Paul bringing in sort of an Eastern influence on George's track.
1, 2, 3.
Track 1 from Revolver, with Paul on lead guitar instead of George, Taxman by the Beatles. Now, track 2 on this record is a very different animal altogether. In fact, I think Eleanor Rigby points towards what the Beatles would seek to accomplish on Sgt. Pepper. I mean, it's a very different track, especially from the one before it.
Yes, and just making a statement in its sequencing in and of itself, that every song on this album is going to be followed by a song that sounds nothing like it.
I think we've talked about this before in one of our past discussions about the Beatles, but this song was the source of some disagreements retroactively between John and Paul over who wrote the song.
Yeah, by the majority of accounts, which includes Paul's and Pete Shotton's pointedly, who was John's close childhood friend and happened to be there when they were writing the song and wrote about it later, and certainly had no axe to grind in terms of wanting to, take John down a few notches. He said rather explicitly, this is how it all went down, that John was in the room, but he was being very dismissive of the fact that other people were chiming in with important contributions to the lyrical content. Namely, George was the one that came up with the lick that the chorus is built on, that, look at all the lonely people, and that it was Ringo who came up with the plot point of having Father Mackenzie, before he was Mackenzie, originally his father McCartney, darning his socks is like a lonely preoccupation for this guy to be doing, that you wouldn't normally associate with a man of the cloth. And Pete himself coming up with the plot point of, at the end, these two lonely people only cross paths too late in life when Eleanor is dead and Father Mackenzie is officiating over her burial. And, that like is the Rod Serling-like perfect note to end that song with. And John was in the room just being kind of snarky. But later on in the Playboy interview, he's claiming a much more substantial role in the birth of what he said was, it was Paul's baby, but I was the midwife or something to that effect.
Yeah, I think it's a case of John almost saying to Paul, how dare you reach out to other people for contributions to this when I'm your chief collaborator?
Right, and that's something that it seems in that album in particular, you can, if you want to reverse engineer the seeds of dissent within their ranks and the breakdown of the esprit de corps, you've got that on one end of things, where John's resentment of, not being Paul's only collaborator on an important song, but then you've got, we'll get to She Said later, but we now know that George had a mighty hand in the shaping of that song because John kind of went dry midway through the sessions. They recorded most of his songs early on, and he was struggling to come up with another number, which is why George ended up with 3 songs there because John was struggling. And so She Said was stitched together from just various licks he had laying around, and George was the one that went to John's house and helped him make that into a single piece. And, knowing what we know what happened when they were recording that song at the end of the sessions, how that stirred Paul's resentment.
Well, speaking of John's lethargy around this time, that brings us to track 3 on the album, I'm Only Sleeping, which provides us with a snapshot into John's life at this time. He was in kind of a millionaire pop star malaise one that also inspired Nowhere Man on the previous Beatles album. Here, he's sort of confessing that he just wants to stay in his own head.
Oh, very much so. And in fact, the Maureen Cleave interview that the deathless quote of "We're more popular than Jesus" came from, she depicts this very vividly, this lifestyle he's got where he's surrounded by all these possessions, and yet he's lost. And, what we now know is he was immersing himself in acid, and it was just a reaction to having achieved every goal he ever dreamed of, and then some. It's not satisfying him. And so he surrounds himself with stuff, and he is living in his own head. She calls him the laziest man in England because he's just so inert. But all the activity is going on in his head, and he's just trying to figure out his next move and what will lead him there. So here he's composing this song as sort of, this observer to life in the world. Just leave me alone. I'm only sleeping.
Right.
Because he's, I'm sleeping before I figure out what the rest of my life's going to be.
And now it's back to George for cut 4 on the album, Love You Too. Now here we have George getting into Indian music and Eastern spiritualism, but despite whatever's happening musically on this track, it's a rather grumpy lyric from George.
Yes. Which had been the pattern. If you look back at his body of songs to that point, there's a thread of disapproval running through them. That don't bother me, you like me too much for yourself. So here's one more in that chain.
We're speaking with Beatles author and expert Robert Rodriguez, who's back with us again to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Beatles album Revolver. Now, following up on what you said earlier, Robert, about the sequencing of this record and how each track sounds nothing like the one that precedes it, we go from George's Love You Too to Paul's Here, There, and Everywhere. And what's interesting to me about this song, the oft-told story about the Beatles hearing the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds album when Beach Boy Bruce Johnston came to London and premiered that record in his hotel suite, and he played it for Lennon and McCartney, and they shuffled off into a corner of the room, and after hearing a track on the album, they started work on Here, There, and Everywhere. And I thought, because Paul has mentioned how pivotal God Only Knows was to him as a songwriter, that God Only Knows inspired Here, There, and Everywhere. But we've since found out that it was actually the bridge to Wouldn't It Be Nice that inspired the song.
Yeah, it's interesting because their hearing of Pet Sounds came midway through the Revolver sessions. So while they were all ears at that listening party and really paying attention to what they were experiencing at that moment, really a lot of the album had already been, conceived and fleshed out, and they had a few more tunes to record. But it's interesting that last minute they were able to bring something in that they were hearing fresh, and we can use this kind of thing. So I think on the whole, Pet Sounds its bigger impact may have come later when they were putting Pepper together.
Yeah.
And trying to come up with an album-length statement such as it is.
Well, people have said, the background harmonies on Here, There, and Everywhere, but I mean, they were doing that on This Boy in a way too. It's not like out of the blue they suddenly discovered how to harmonize. They're already doing it.
And it wasn't as if they needed Pet Sounds to introduce that to something that had been present as far back as In My Room.
Well, let's listen to this composite version of Here, There, and Everywhere, which was one of the B-sides on the 1996 Real Love CD single that features take 7 of the song with Paul's guide vocal into take 13 with an overdub of the Beatles' harmonies. Another track from the 1996 CD single for the Beatles' reunion song, Real Love, a remix of Yellow Submarine featuring a discarded opening monologue from Ringo. Our guest today is Beatles author and expert Robert Rodriguez, who's written several books on the Fab Four, including Revolver, How the Beatles Reimagined Rock and Roll. Now, the song we just heard was written primarily by Paul, with a lyric assist from Donovan, and it's the kind of song that, had Paul or John sang, could have come off as cynical. But with Ringo, it's just not going to take on that flavor.
No, it's not. He's got that everyman persona, as well as that sort of child man aspect that was so wonderfully utilized in A Hard Day's Night and Help. And plus, at the same time, you got the Beatles cartoon going on, which totally pegs him as the dummy of the group, as it were. So, yeah, on the one level, it is that kids sing-along thing, as Paul originally conceived it, having this idea of kids, singing the chorus on the playground. but the heads at the time are listening to it, and they're picking up this utopian ideal,
right?
Sense of community, and so it absolutely works on that level as well. Probably not as, it was not intended the way some read it as, with this euphemism for second-all, but it certainly has, beyond the immediate sort of childlike imagery, something else going on as well.
And that takes us to the last song on side one, She Said, which was inspired by an annoying encounter John and George had with actor Peter Fonda.
Yeah. By all accounts, he was really wanting to ingratiate himself. And, they're partying in L.A., and members of the Byrds are there, and you've got a lot going on. And, they certainly were finding an easier time bonding with McGuinn and Crosby than they were with Fonda, who kept trying to impress them. One of the things he did on that occasion was dive in the swimming pool and walk from one end to the other.
Right.
Just fascinated for 2 seconds. But, they were tripping, and apparently George was having a bad time of it on this occasion, and that was when Peter saw his in, and in trying to calm him down, he was relating the childhood gunshot injury he had where he was clinically dead on the OR table, and they brought him back. And so he's telling him, I know what it's like to be dead. It's okay. You're going to be fine. You're going to get through this. And meanwhile, John's feeling like he's harshing his mellow, and it's like, knock it off,
Right.
Put that in your head. And, his takeaway is a great little lick that they're able to repurpose as a song. What's kind of funny, though, is by all his later tellings, especially as the Beatles were breaking up and he's doing the Plastic Ono Band, and he was always given this rather harrowing depiction of his childhood, the dynamic between his parents and their split and all that. He's got this bridge, and she said, when I was a boy, everything was right. It's sort of like taking you out of the darkness of this, I know what it's like to be dead, but, wait a minute, when I was a kid, everything was right. All was well in my world. So it's an interesting sort of contrast that he just throws in there.
And this recording session turned out to be kind of testy between Paul and the rest of the Beatles.
Yeah, as alluded to earlier, this was done at the very tail end of the Revolver sessions. And they were under deadline. They had to get the album finished. They then had to run off and do this quick tour of the continent. They were playing shows in Munich and Hamburg, and then prepare for their Far East tour and then America. So they had to get the record done. They're up against the gun, and John finally, with George's help, brings in this last-minute addition to the album to round it out to 14 songs. And in the middle of recording it, it was done in a single session, one day, unlike everything else on the album. As Paul related later, we got into a Barney, and I walked out. And when he had made that admission in the Many Years From Now book he did with Barry Miles,
right.
It's not something he had to confess to. It's not like the fans were privy to this or had suspected it or anything like that. It was not an admission he had to make, but he throws it out there. And so when I was doing my Revolver book, I looked into it to see, well, is this true? Could it be true? And, you can go through the isolated tracks and some of the session stuff that's been leaked out, and that kind of points you in the right direction when you could see where the bass is situated in the stereo mix as opposed to, is it locked in like they're all playing together, or is it on a separate track or whatever? And so that led me to the conclusion that, this was a later edition. And the smoking gun I found, as it were, was in sitting through the hours and hours of Twickenham recordings made in '69 during the Let It Be sessions. And it's after George has quit the group on January 10th. And a few days later, and this is one day after they had this band meeting, which also went badly, and George stormed out of that, when John and Paul are having this deep discussion about George's dissatisfaction. And they talk about, John's talking about his own compositions, how, if they're at loggerheads about an arrangement or something, he's telling Paul, the only way I can get what I wanted is if I gave it to George to play. And then Paul goes, she said. And that is like an admission
there
that
it is.
That was what made push come to shove in the studio, is that they had a disagreement about the arrangement of the song, and apparently John won the argument and Paul stormed out and got George to play the bass on it. So there you go.
Well, let's hear John's original home demo for the song, and then we'll segue into the finished master. So let's flip the album over and start side 2, which begins with Paul's Good Day's Sunshine. For years, I had just assumed that the entire world loved this song, but recently I've seen it singled out as lightweight and the kind of song Paul could write in his sleep. Now, that may be true, But I still think it's a great song, and it's made an even better recording by George Martin's piano solo.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, play it sort of ragtimey flourishes in the instrumental break. Yeah, you can point to it as lightweight, and maybe Paul has suffered from being in the same band with the people possessing such natural gravitas, John and George.
Right.
But, would people level the same criticism against John Sebastian of the Love and Spoonful, who, in fact, his song, the Love and Spoonful's recording of Daydream was what inspired Paul to write that song? You're going to accuse John Sebastian of being a lightweight and, bubblegum? I don't think so.
Exactly. If I could play Dave Dexter for a moment, wouldn't it have made sense to start off side 2 with Rain and then go into Good Day Sunshine?
Yeah, I think that it's an interesting observation, about meteorological conditions being, between John and Paul, a subject of songwriting, and they're sort of like flip sides of the same coin.
Right.
But, I mean, if you wanted to be thematic, that certainly was something they could have done.
It would have upped John's quotient of songs, too, on the American release.
Yeah, for sure.
Next up on side 2 of Revolver, a John song called And Your Bird Can Sing. And of course, for American fans, original American fans, this first appeared on the Yesterday and Today album, but it was intended for Revolver. And we are talking about the British release today, which is the official album in the Beatles canon. I've heard this song described as John speaking to Paul. In other words, the message of this song is, I'm into all of this cool stuff, and you can't relate to it. I don't read this song that way at all.
Well, that's a theory, and there have been a lot of theories about this song, and I think this vacuum arises when John himself was not very forthcoming about it. He was very dismissive about it years later when asked about it in the Playboy interview, and he branded a throwaway. It's like, that's a throwaway. Everyone should have such throwaways because it's just a marvelous arrangement, fantastic performance. And I think the lyrics are quite sharp-edged, I think it's quite good. I made the case in my Revolver book based on some research I had done, going on at the time. It was, I can't remember which writer it was that wrote the book that made the first connection between it being a response to Frank Sinatra based on this article written by Gay Talese, A Man and His Music, when that TV documentary was being filmed.
Right.
And it's basically going on at length about Sinatra being this alpha male, successful guy who, throughout the article, when he's surrounded by his toadies, uses bird as slang for the male member.
Right.
And he was very particularly sharp-edged in his criticism of the Beatles at that time. And in fact, like a month before the Revolver session started, he beat the Beatles out for something at the Grammy, some particular award that they were both up for, and Frank won. And it might have been something that really stuck in John's craw about this guy who clearly is very materialistic. Think he's got the world at his feet, and he likes to use the word bird. So John, as a slam back at Sinatra, writes this whole song, just attacking somebody who can't see the forest for the trees and whose possessions are not satisfying them. And, someday when you're ready to see the light, I'll be there for you.
That would make more sense because Lennon had a habit of doing that with, like Serve Yourself, attacking Dylan, something he'd read in the paper. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, and maybe in later years when asked about it, he might have been a little ashamed or embarrassed about a song created out of spite. And, it's not one of his prouder moments. But it's a fine recording, and, who knows, he might have even forgotten why he'd written it by that point, because this is the guy that couldn't remember which album came first, Rubber Soul or Revolver.
That's true. And by all accounts, he was more of a Bing Crosby fan. So, to further quash the theory that John was disparaging towards Paul at this time, here they are in the middle of a giggle fest as they try to overdub vocals onto an early version of the song. We're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Beatles' Revolver album with author and expert Robert Rodriguez. And the next cut on the record, well, it's a stark contrast to Good Day Sunshine, which some dismiss as lightweight. I don't agree with that, but I think everyone can agree that For No One is one of Paul's stronger cuts and another in a long line of songs inspired by his tempestuous relationship with then-girlfriend Jane Asher.
Yeah, the eternal wellspring of negative songs.
Yeah.
But it is interesting that it is such a singular composition in Paul's catalog of Beatle work, in that it is so stark and unsentimental. This is the guy that effortlessly could craft these great, syrupy love songs. Even if he thought he wasn't being syrupy, people would take them that way because, he really captured that so well. I wouldn't call I Will from the White Album syrupy, but it's so sentimental, romantic love, its depiction. But here, it's something, it's brutal in its depiction of the reality of a breakup. She no longer needs you. Love that should have lasted years. It could have been applied to himself and Jane, as a lot of people thought, they were made for each other, this great artsy couple. But, it didn't pan out that way. And this is sort of an outlier 2 years before, it finally actually ended. But, John was, unlike with Eleanor Rigby, never laid any claim to giving any input on the song, but he did point it out as, one of Paul's finest sets of lyrics, proving he could write a decent set of lyrics if he tried. He didn't believe he could, and therefore he didn't.
In a strange way, I guess if you're listening to solo McCartney, I think the song Mistress and Maid on the album Off the Ground might offer the female perspective to this song, if you want to think of it as a late period sequel.
Yeah, that's a really good observation.
Your day breaks.
The next cut on side 2 of Revolver is Dr. Robert, and this song would serve as confirmation for anyone out there wondering if John Lennon was into the drug culture, because the Dr. Robert of this song was actually a real feel-good doctor in New York City.
Yes, and I'm not sure how much people would have been aware of that at the time, because, here he is laying out this very, explicit, if you're down, he'll pick you up, take a drink from his special cup, all this stuff about the wonders of chemistry, as it were, for straights. And it's, in its way, almost extending the thread of the Rolling Stones with Mother's Little Helper, which had just come out in Aftermath, which is basically a song about Valium. So here you've got a real-life guy who'd been, the fix-it guy for celebrities by reputation, the Kennedys and a lot of, New York socialites and people like that. So he's sort of marveling at, that world and this guy's capabilities. And, the same way he would extol Timothy Leary, sort of obliquely with Tomorrow Never Knows at the end of the record. It's just a way of calling that out. And he does it, that whole arrangement of the song, the well, 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 middle eight part, it's almost like a Christmas carol. They're singing it, those choir boy voices, and it's just funny to put a message out there, but sort of disguise its true intent by the musical framework.
Robert, I've listened to Revolver so many times that to pick out a favorite song is near impossible, but in this re-listen, in preparation for this interview, I've decided that my favorite cut on the album is the next track, I Want to Tell You.
It is such a great tune.
Oh, yeah.
It's a deceptively great song. Everything about it, everything about the arrangement, that dissonant piano part that Paul plays.
Which, by the way, was that a mistake that was left in?
I don't think so.
No, okay.
I think he did that on purpose. And just like the melisma at the end, he's going kind of out of tune. I think the song has kind of a circular theme to it, the fade up and then the fade out. He's basically trying to articulate his own lack of articulation as, he was relating his acid experience in an album that's just drenched in acid references, of how he's got all these thoughts that he cannot get out or put into words to convey the experience to other people. So, and there's other ways you can look at it. If you take the drug starting point out, of not being able to really express to fans, what's going on in his head or anybody that's listening to him, whoever his audience is. But everything about that musically supports that lack of articulation. That sort of, that Hendrixy chord that he plays in there that's kind of dissonant, everything about it, it's so artfully constructed. What John would say later on about, he was speaking of Within You, Without You, and he'd say how that's George's genius of marrying the music to what he's saying. I would say this is a perfectly good earlier example.
And it's a real shame that George didn't tour more, because in the Live in Japan set, he does this song.
Yes,
and it
that
sounds
made me really
great.
Happy, because I'm thinking most fans are overlooking it, and certainly he must not think much of it until, he pulled it out. It's like, good.
Yeah.
He does remember it, and he does value it.
WFDU FM.
We're back talking with Beatles author and expert Robert Rodriguez about the 50th anniversary of the Beatles' Revolver album. And we're up to the song Got to Get You Into My Life, which holds special meaning for me because this was my Beatles song, the single that made me a Beatles fan back in 1976. Of course, at the time, I didn't realize it was the Beatles. I thought it was a Wings song. But,
well, they were on tour, so.
Yeah. And I have to admit, and I'm a Paul apologist. I'm a Paul booster. I'm Richard Buskin's worst nightmare. But the fact that this is inspired by pot is a little disappointing to me.
Is it really?
Yeah, there have been plenty of times where I've met a girl and I thought she was wonderful, and this song fit that experience perfectly. And then to find out later that Paul was not talking about getting a woman into his life, but he wanted more pot in his life, it was just a little disappointing.
Well, put it this way, it was a starting point, and I think, once he got that initial inspiration in the lick, then he took it beyond that. So it transcends what his original intent was, but, you can totally remove that frame of reference, and it's still a highly successful composition. And it could be, as we know now, as I talk about in the book, it was originally their intent to record this in Memphis at Stax. And so you can easily see, if you look at the record that ended up coming out, and this obviously soulful Stax/Motown composition might have been something they had in mind all along for if that original plan had played out. What better place to record a song?
Right.
The first time they used brass on a record. I mean, even the brass on Yellow Submarine was sampled. This was an actual brass section.
Right.
And guys from the Georgie Fames band. So it's really something that I think it stands beyond its origins. But, yeah, like you, back in 76, when the song was all over the radio, at least I knew it was the Beatles, but it didn't sound 10 years old. It didn't sound dated at all. It's not like Moni Moni came out in 1976 or something.
Right.
This was, it was very much of its time. And, certainly Earth, Wind, and Fire saw the potential and made it their own.
We're back with Beatles author and expert Robert Rodriguez to wrap up our discussion, track by track, of the Beatles' Revolver album. And that takes us to the last cut on the record, Tomorrow Never Knows, a song whose title, at the very least, was inspired by a Ringoism, something that Ringo said in passing. Musically, of course, this is full-on psychedelia. When I was reading Candy Leonard's book, Beatleness, I thought it was funny that fans back in 1966, they got to the end of the record and heard this song and thought, this is what they left us with? This freak out? What is this? But I'll tell you what, in terms of pure psychedelia, this to me is more authentic than, and I'll get in trouble with the Sgt. Pepper fans here, it's more authentic psychedelia than anything on Pepper.
I'll buy that. I think what struck me as the first time I heard it, and going back to however young I was when I heard the song, which was obviously after the 60s, it was sometime in the 70s, I was struck by the fact that it had that Indian flourish in it without being full-blown Indian.
Right.
It had this rock band backing, the really powerful drums, and that backward guitar in the middle of it. So it was like this very interesting fusion of sounds to me. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. This is really, it's really tough and it's got some grit to it. At the same time, sort of, speaking to something not really tangible. It's all, in your mind and post-life and all that sort of thing. He was, pulling out of Timothy Leary's reading of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which I didn't know at the time. I mean, to me, it was just, it clearly meant as a transcendental message, whatever he was trying to say. And I just loved the sound of every bit of it. I just thought, this is really something. And then it ended with that little honky-tonk piano at the end.
Yeah.
Wow, what the hell was that?
And Ringo's drumming on this, as you mentioned. I mean, I remember one review said, Ringo invented trip-hop, which that's valid,
Sure.
in listening to this. And, of course, McCartney's contributions were the tape loops. He gets kind of a bad rap as being lightweight, but he was a guy who was experimenting with the avant-garde, except for the most part, he didn't put it into his work around this time.
Right. He applied it to the people around him. He was John's best producer.
Yeah, he was. And he came up with the idea of, of putting these, I don't know, are they seagulls or something? What are they? I don't know what they are.
It's sped up laughter. And if you isolate the loops, which is possible, you can hear it more for what it is. And it's a loop. They just had it repeat itself. But yeah, it's got that seagull kind of milieu to it. And if you don't know what you're listening to the first time you hear it, it's immediately putting a picture in your head, seashore, and you're just waiting for the ocean sounds to kick in or something. But yeah, it's just this amazing blend of stuff. And I've always sort of, whenever I'm making comparisons to this album and the one that got all the acclaim, I make the tie between this song and Mr. Kite on Pepper as John compositions where they're so tricked out in production, you then want to strip it away and say, is there really a song there? And to me, you can do that with Tomorrow Never Knows because lyrically it does take you someplace. And yeah, it's a single chord drone, but there is a there. Whereas Mr. Kite, to me, it's like the wonderful production, wonderful resulting record. But to me, it's like him reading a menu. The lyrics, it's nice and they rhyme and scan well and all that stuff, but it doesn't really do much for me beyond that. Whereas the way Tomorrow Never Knows, it gets you to think a little bit.
It's the first recording of its kind to sound like this, and when I mean pure psychedelia, I think of the kind of stuff Pink Floyd would do on their debut a year later, things like Interstellar Overdrive and Astronomy Domine. That seems to be heavily influenced by Tomorrow Never Knows. It's the same kind of, I don't want to say musique concrete, but it's the same kind of mindset where we're going to throw out all the rules and we're just going to have something hypnotic.
Right, and you can build it atop this rock band foundation.
Right.
Yeah. So it's a great correlation. It's interesting, Norman Smith, who was producing Pink Floyd, had, moved on from the Beatles by the time of Revolver. But they're recording in the same studio, and you just have to wonder, how often they come and look over the shoulder of his successor and see what they're up to and take these ideas forward.
So the album comes out. The Beatles are touring in the U.S., and this album is barely mentioned in their press conferences because it's the "We're Bigger Than Jesus" controversy.
Oh, yes.
In fact, they don't even play a single song from this record on the tour.
Right, like it doesn't exist.
Yeah, I mean, that's just crazy to me. Of course, they're doing Paperback Writer, which, okay, that was their single at the time.
Yeah,
but
they're not to something contemporaneous.
Right, you would think you've got this record, you know how great this record is. There are songs that they could have performed live from this album. I mean, yes, Eleanor Rigby would be tough. That's not going to happen. But they could have done She Said, She Said. They could have done with an electric piano. They could have done Good Day Sunshine.
Sure. They could have done I'm Only Sleeping.
Right.
Even maybe Andrew Bird Can Sing.
They could have done,
Robert.
they could have done Taxman. But instead, they don't do anything from this album. Do we have any reason that we've read about or heard about why they didn't even bother to attempt anything from it?
Yeah, because they really saw themselves as wearing two hats at that time. The performing outfit, which had little to do with music, but was simply a sop to the fans that want to see us. So, okay, we'll give them this tribal right, but really has nothing to do with the music we're making right now. And I do think they were a little protective of their new recordings. The one that they did do live, Paperback Writer, it's not very good. They're the live performances that we know. And I think because the will wasn't there, or maybe they were just under-rehearsed, and it just didn't come off. And I think they probably didn't want to tackle the new stuff for fear of ruining it. And they did Nowhere Man off Rubber Soul, and that would have been another newer song on that tour. But, even that, you've got those a cappella opening vocals. The rest of the song's pretty basic. I think that they didn't want to subject these great songs they were very proud of and this great musical accomplishment to fans that weren't going to appreciate it anyway. And,
by the time that they toured America, nobody really would have cared about it because Revolver, even though it was obviously a huge record, it was not held up as this great advance forward, as this incredible album. It was almost lost in all of the Bigger Than Jesus hoopla. Right, and then you had 6 weeks earlier the Yesterday and Today album cover. Suddenly, being, not the cuddly fun mop tops anymore. It's like, what's going on here? I do think that they sort of eased the way with Pepper, when they put out in advance the Strawberry Fields Penny Lane single,
concurrent with their new look.
Right.
So here's new music, and look what we look like now. So it was less confusing to the fans when they do this experimental, outrageous stuff, but they still look like the Mop Tops that put out Help the year before. I do think that, number one, you've got, the American Revolver, not quite the full fleshed-out vision.
Yep.
And number two, they're going about business as usual, but wait a minute, they just given us this collection of weird songs. What's going on here? I think it was just very confusing.
Yeah, they were two bands. So, you've written a book about Revolver. You wrote it some time ago. And let's talk a little bit about where people can find out more if they're intrigued by this discussion.
Well, it is on Amazon, and it is in Barnes & Noble's last I looked, and it's out there. And it actually won an award for Best Rock and Roll Research, which I appreciated. But, it's definitely, it was my effort to contextualize the making of that album in terms of their career and what changed after they made it in terms of their approach to their art. And I really think I didn't have necessarily a full-blown thesis when I started the book, but the more I did the research, I was recognizing that this really was a turning point. This really was, in addition to sort of segueing from a performing band to a studio band, this was where you see, at the exact half-life of the Beatles, midway between the recording of Please Please Me and Abbey Road, that the torch is being passed from John to Paul in terms of who's really driving the band. John, in the previous album, really hit that sweet spot with the songs like Girl and In My Life and Nowhere Man and Norwegian Wood. And now, he's writing these, mostly acid songs taking place in his own head, while Paul is really raising his game in competition. And that's the other reason why I make the point that not only is Pepper, sort of not quite on the same level in terms of being a full-blown Beatle album, but if you compare song for song, I think Paul's compositions on Revolver just kill what he's got going on with Pepper. Who'd rather have, a Fixing a Hole or Lovely Rita when you can have a Here, There, and Everywhere and a For No One? I mean, those are just amazing. And plus Eleanor Rigby besides.
Sure.
I mean, you can't, quantify art and everything's subjective, but I think he was digging deeper for Revolver and maybe relying more on production when it came to Pepper to sort of tart up the composition.
And also, as wonderful as Within You Without You is on Sgt. Pepper, you're getting much more of George on Revolver.
Yeah, more rounded Harrison experience, yeah. George the guitarist, I want to tell you, and really coming up with that matching of music to message. And, you've got the full-blown raga, his first attempt with Love You Too, and then social commentary with Taxman.
Now, this album, as I mentioned, has been reappraised and is now high up on the list. Another one that is almost vying for the same kind of lofty position is the White Album. And I remember last we spoke that you said something about perhaps looking into the Beatles' White Album in one of your next books.
Yep, for sure. I think it's a fascinating study. I think that, like the Let It Be project, a lot of what they had to say about it in hindsight wasn't necessarily true or valid, but it is a fascinating study of, this is the first thing they did after the loss of Brian in terms of a full-blown album. And, it was seen by them at the time as a follow-up to Pepper, this most exalted of creations they'd released. Right. And they hadn't seen Mystery Tour as anything other than a film soundtrack and sort of a detour. But you have so much that's changed from the romantic relationships between John and his wife and Paul and Jane. That's changed. Suddenly you've got the Yoko factor entering in. You've got them now as running their own business affairs, talent scouting, producing other people, and they went away to ostensibly study meditation and really evolved sort of into a songwriting camp. They come back and they just want to put out everything. They want to record everything. No longer are they, well, let's pick the best songs out of this. It's like, no, this is what we have to say. We're just going to put it all out there and, really take listeners on a journey, no matter how sprawling it became. That was what their determination was to do. George Martin's trying to get them reeled back in, but they're beyond his control at this point.
Yeah. Fascinating stuff. And also, we should tell the listeners about the podcast, Something About the Beatles, which you do with Richard Buskin, who we've also had on the program.
Yes. And it's basically conversations like this where we try to zero in on a single aspect of Beatle, topics, and God knows there's so much. And listeners have been great at suggesting things. So, yeah, we do that, and it can be found on iTunes, and that's somethingaboutthebeatles.com and Facebook as well. And we try to crank out a show a week.
When the upcoming Ron Howard documentary about the Beatles' touring years comes out, you have an open invitation along with Richard and Mitch Axelrod, actually, because we did that one on the Beatles 1, to come on and talk about it, because that is quickly shaping up to be perhaps a contentious release. Maybe not the film itself, but the album that's coming along with it.
Right.
We'll save it, I guess, but it'll be interesting.
Yeah.
Well, Robert, I want to thank you so much for coming on and helping us celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Beatles' Revolver album. I enjoyed the chat, as usual.
And honored to be here.
Well, hey, listen, the pleasure's all ours, and we're going to wrap up this discussion with that song I mentioned, that Paul McCartney solo song that I considered a kind of sequel to For No One. So from 1993's Off the Ground album, here's Mistress and Maid.
She's